instead of transcending, we can contend, transcend and contend. And contending means actually grappling with it. So maybe there's a reason why I'm feeling anxious right now. And it's not just a distraction. Actually, that thought that just came up, it's telling me I have something I need to do that I haven't done today. And so I'm not going to just, push it away, which if I'm busy, I can't. But actually, no, I need to think about that. Or let's say I had a presentation I gave to a community or some work project that didn't go well. A part of me wants to just move on to the next thing right away. But if I'm noticing a pain pattern of any kind in my body, well, maybe there's actually some learning there. And that through exploring it and listening, it's more about, in this case, listening in and trying to understand what's going on, I might learn a thing or two. And maybe there's a real piece of wisdom or insight I can take from that and I can move forward with it. So that's those are the two routes to take once we have that self-awareness.
Hey, it's Rocky. Welcome to Richer Soul. Today's guest is Rabbi Matthew Ponak, who's going to talk about living life on your terms. Imagine it's 12 months from now, and you've achieved your major life goals. How does it feel to be in the best shape of your life? To wake up energized, excited about the day? To have great relationships and friends who support you and propel you forward? How does it feel to have an excess of money, to be able to make the choices you want? To be fearless and open to trying new adventures? Imagine being connected to the universe and it providing everything you desire. It's possible over time, and your past does not dictate your future. The only thing holding you back from this vision is you. It's time to take control of our thoughts and use them to our advantage. Welcome to Richer Soul, where we achieve our dreams and create harmony to health, wealth, relationships, time, and spirituality. If you have not had a chance to listen to episodes 1 through 9, I encourage you to go back and listen to the framework behind Richer Soul and how to create the life of your dreams. You can also find all the show notes for this episode at richersoul.com. Today's quote comes from Michael Singer. There are trillions of cells in your body that are doing what they're supposed to do. All of nature, everything. And you wake up and you realize, I'm not doing any of this. I didn't make my body. I didn't make my mind think. I didn't make my heart beat. I don't make my breath breathe. It's amazing what our bodies do each day without a single thought from us. It seems the more we think, the more we mess it up. Understanding how we fit into the bigger part of the universe is a journey. And a big part of that journey is spirituality. I believe you have to find what you believe and then take the time to examine it and test it and challenge it and then live in harmony with it. That's our goal today, to share some wisdom in the sense to have a dialogue, not of right or wrong, but of possibility. To tie that back to historical religious beliefs and how they fit in a modern world. And what are the benefits to us? Today, we have an expert in one area of religion to share his viewpoints. I encourage you to listen with an open mind, challenge your beliefs, and ask if you are being best served by them. Rabbi Matthew Ponak is a teacher of Jewish mysticism, a spiritual counselor, and the co-founder of the Mekorah Institute, an online spiritual center for embodied practice. He's ordained with honors as a rabbi at the neo-Hasidic Rabbinical School of Hebrew College. He also holds a master's degree in Contemplative Religions from Naropa University. He lives in British Victoria, Columbia, and he's a certified as a focusing professional to guide others to deeper self-knowledge and healing. Welcome to Richer Soul, Rabbi Matthew Ponak. It's great to have you join us today.
Thanks so much for having me on, Rocky.
And I'm excited for the conversation. As always, let's start at the beginning. What was it like when you were growing up, and how much did your family and school teach you about money?
I've been thinking about that and how so much of what I learned about money growing up was really by example. And especially as I got older, it was understanding how much, not just my parents, but my ancestors in the last few generations really put into helping me be in a place where I had a lot more choices in my life. So yeah, I had an allowance growing up, and there was a lot of emphasis on, let's save it, let's put it in a bank account. From a young age, I had a bank account, and I had the opportunity to spend or save. I had a brother, a biological brother, let's say, before my parents got divorced, and then I had a couple stepbrothers. But between my brother and I, he was the saver and I was the spender, and that seemed to be a genetic quality. I'm not sure. But there was lots of opportunity for me as the inherent spender to learn about what happened when I ran out of money. And I really kind of saw the ups and downs a little bit of that. But as I got older, I increasingly realized the great efforts that my great-grandparents took, for example. So my father's father's father came from Russia. And the way he got over to Canada initially was he was being drafted into the Tsar's army and did not want to go because as a Jewish person in that era, he was going to be sent to the front lines to die, essentially. And he cut off 2 of his toes and got to leave that situation. And through, I think, a relative or some kind of chain immigration, came to Canada, came to Quebec. And he worked essentially as a scrap metal peddler. He was a strong man, and he would collect kind of like a got junk, but he had a horse and a buggy, and later on a truck. And he was then selling the scraps he would pick up to other places and not making a lot. And his son eventually became a bookkeeper. And when my father was born, so my grandfather was working as a bookkeeper during the day and spending hours in the evenings getting his accounting degree. And over the course of my father's childhood, his father became an accountant. And so my father, by the time he was in university, got to study more of what he wanted, so to speak, but he really was career focused as well. It wasn't just education for its own sake. He became a professor. He became a professor of labor relations. He worked in a business school. And over the course of these generations, I grew up and I had all these choices of who I wanted to be. And I ended up following my passions all over the place, from a multidisciplinary degree in my undergrad to a master's in contemplative religions in a Buddhist university, and eventually feeling the call to be a rabbi. And I really kind of got to carve my own path, but it was because of the sacrifices that were made and the real kind of intergenerational perspective that my ancestors, most of whom I never met, were making on behalf of my father and ultimately on behalf of me.
And I know with our family, and I've watched wealth be created, one of the biggest things we always worry about is when life gets too easy for the kids, that's when wealth disappears.
That's interesting.
So I think it sounds like you have avoided that curse, is what I'll call it.
So far, so good. I think one of the things that has really helped me and gotten me motivated. So here's another example that just coming to mind right now. My father was very generous in helping me pay for my education so that I wasn't, and this is what I've come to know often as it's something that's common in the Jewish world that I inhabited growing up, is the parents are paying for the university or for education for their kids so that they're leaving without debt or without as much debt. And what I really took advantage and I explored, but at this point in my life, my father, he could be helping us out, but he's extremely sparing. And I really appreciate that, because I made a choice a couple of years ago to leave the synagogue life and to become a full-time author and lecturer and counselor and really take my own path in this. And it was risky and it was full of adventure, and every day is an adventure on some level, right? When you're starting out. But what it's meant is that it's really improved my work ethic. It's hard to sit around and not do anything when you need to put food on the table for your family. You need to think about longer term goals for yourself. And I know my kids are going to be okay in all those kinds of bigger areas, but day to day, our quality of life is very much dependent on how I'm working. And I appreciate that as well. It's really hard to slack off or to misspend in big ways when you're relying on your daily bread.
I see that in Indian culture. I see it in Jewish culture. It's more of an aptitude to talk about money, more of an aptitude of focusing on education, more of an aptitude of pushing and propelling and helping their kids kind of get to the next level. And that's just something I've noticed. It's probably not true for everyone, but it seems to happen more often than not versus other types of people that we look at.
There's a really lovely story in a, let's say, 2,000-year-old Jewish text that says there's a man who's planting a carob tree, and someone goes up to him and he says, this isn't going to bear fruit for another 70 years. And he says, yeah, I know, it's not for me. It's for the coming generations. And that is the whole idea, is that there's an attitude I think we all can adopt. Maybe it's sort of more prevalent in some cultures or subcultures right now, but imagine that is you're going to be giving blessings to future generations you won't even necessarily know, but there's a great sense of pride and well-being that can come. Pride in the good sense, the good kind of, I'm proud of my children, grandchildren, my descendants, and giving is one of the best ways to feel good, in fact. And so that's a value I think that, perhaps our cultures do share.
And it's funny because that's a mindset issue. I think when you look at people who are wealthy, they have a very different mindset issue than people who are poor. The way they look at money and time is dramatically different. So you don't have to be super wealthy. I mean, the point is, when you have that wealthy mindset, you're thinking 50 years in advance. Whereas when you have a poor mindset, you're thinking of the moment. You don't even think about saving for tomorrow because it's just a different way of looking at it, I guess. And that's kind of the reason we always ask this question, is to look at different mindsets and how childhood and money and turns into adult and money in life.
And I also know from some studying I've done in the Hindu system that there is a very important phase of life traditionally in Hinduism called the householder phase. And the householder phase is different than the ashram phase, is different than the wandering mystic phase at the end of life. It's actually about building wealth on some level and providing for the family and all of those things. And Judaism has a very strong emphasis on the householder lifestyle as well. It can't just be for the moment. It's great to live in the moment, but we also need to be thinking about those longer term things. And there's another, I think, noteworthy overlap between the two traditions on that topic as well.
I see it culturally. I don't see it from the religious side because I'm just not as familiar with that whole area. But it's quite interesting. So how did you get into all the religious studies? You started right off from an early age, I believe.
I would say I was raised in more of a cultural Jewish way. And going to Jewish school, learning Hebrew and some of the texts and traditions, but it wasn't a religious, let's say, or even spiritual. It was about, this is our culture and here's how we're orienting towards the world, very community-based. And the people I knew growing up, they're like siblings more than they are friends, if you catch my drift. It was a very connected community where I grew up in Alberta, in Calgary, in Canada. When I was a teenager, I sort of wandered into this Jewish mysticism class, this class on spirituality for teens in this case. And it was like a part of me awoke that I didn't know even existed before. And it was like the passion. I didn't, until you're exposed to what your calling is, it's hard to even know what it feels like to feel so aligned with a passion like that. And that initial moment took me through several years of study as a teenager. And eventually, I went through different phases. I felt like I got burned by religion when I was 18, maybe to 19 and 20 on some level. I got more academic in my view of it. I got more into sort of universal meditation, new age, mindfulness type stuff, and eventually found myself in a Buddhist university or Buddhist inspired university in Colorado. And it was there when I was at my most sort of trying to escape the Jewish world and try to just be a universalist that I started getting these experiences where I felt very called to be a rabbi. And so it took me a few years to make that decision and go to rabbinical school, but that's around the time that things started to kind of turn back home after journeying outwards for a while.
Circuitous route, which is not unusual.
Yeah, we actually sometimes really have to follow our hearts, or we have to leave home in order to find it again. And there's no end to that kind of striving, but it's really, as long as we're combining it with our brains, following our hearts is a really important part of becoming who we are.
It is. I think the bigger issue is, can you make sure that following your heart will at least semi-fill your pocketbook?
That's what I mean by listening to our brains as well. That if all we are is heart, there's a book called The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. It's a very famous sort of early 20th century spiritual classic. And he compares the heart and the mind to a sailboat. And the heart is the sails. That's kind of the propulsion, but the mind is the rudder. And if all we have are sails, we're just going to be blown all over the place. And try imagine to push a boat with a rudder. It doesn't get you very far. And yeah, but I agree that if our hearts are taking us into foolishness, then we're not really following that integrated way.
It sounds like you've studied a variety of different religions. And in doing so, one of the things we've always kind of, I'll say, believed or see is that when it all boils down to it, many of them are very similar in what their messages are and what the core is, told in very, very different ways. As an expert in that, am I on track? Am I off track? Am I missing something?
I think there are universals that can be found in every religion. I think every religion is going to emphasize different things more than others. And I also believe from my studies and my experiences in different communities that that not everything is leading up the same mountain, spiritually or religiously. There's actually many mountains. And I think that's a beautiful thing. I'm not a perennialist. I don't believe there's always been the same wisdom in every religion and the same path. There's different paths for the same mountains. We're in a mountain range. And what that means, in my opinion, is that there's actually some mountains we haven't explored yet. There's some coming over the horizon. There's so much potential in religious and spiritual evolution. But in essence, an emphasis on kindness. If there's a religion that says we shouldn't be kind to each other, I don't think that's a very good religion. I don't think that's a religion that's going to last very long in human history, because it's not going to be compelling to people. But those kinds of fundamentals are found everywhere. But when it comes to sort of the nature of, let's say, God or realization or the true goal of life, you'll find diverse opinions. And I think that's great, because there's a lot to learn from and to explore.
There is. And I think part of the more I learn, the more I realize sometimes it's man's opinion, not necessarily what is written. And we misconstrue a lot, or we misinterpret a lot of what's happened, or what is said.
For sure, that human beings are finite beings, and we're not perfect. And anytime someone's writing a sacred text or an interpretation or a new book, we're going to be doing the best we can with what we have. But I don't think there's such a thing as true perfection in this physical world. And to me, that's also part of the fun. Is we get to explore and learn, and that's a journey that never ends.
Well, I guess if we get to true perfection, then we've gotten to God, right? In a sense.
And I think there are moments when we can have something like that, and that's in the Jewish tradition. That's what Shabbat, that's what the day of rest, or just sort of that mindset that we enter is all about. It's about saying, right now the world is perfect. I'm going to celebrate it. I'm going to be thankful for everything I have. But it's contrasted with the work week. The consciousness of, there's work to do because there's some fixing to do, whether in the world or in myself. But if we can have a life that's punctuated with moments of true joy and acceptance and gratitude for everything that is, alongside this work mentality and the fixing and transformation, to me, that's that kind of enlightened balance that we can strike, whether or not we ever reach true perfection in the long term.
And I think a day of rest is good. I think too often we run around too much. And because I remember when I was growing up, we had blue laws. The stores were closed on Sunday, and you didn't go out, and there wasn't so much of this other activity going on. People took it a little bit easier, and that was always kind of nice. And the other issue, though, that always ended up, because we lived in an area of a wide variety of religions, the Jewish people took off on Saturday.
Yeah.
Which threw everything off as far as knowing, okay, I can't go to that store on that day. I have to wait till the other days. And it's always interesting to see. So we're here to chat about your book. What inspired you to write the book, Embodied Kabbalah, Jewish Mysticism for All People?
Well, it was really twofold. One of the reasons is that I feel in this world of increasing global spirituality, of people thinking about what religions have in common or being flexible and where they're learning from. I think I feel the need for some of the Jewish teachings to come out more prominently in that space, that there are some elements of Judaism that I think are really needed right now for people of any background. And I mentioned one of them before, the idea of this day of rest, but there's a particular way that it's done in Judaism that I think is such a great antidote to the endless notifications and news feeds and social media on our phones. There's methods in there that I just want everyone to know, because it's really helpful for fighting burnout, for feeling refreshed, and just having a great life if people can incorporate that. And it doesn't have to be on Friday night to Saturday night, for example. I really believe that people can find a place where it fits in their own life, however that is. So that's one reason. It's just this stuff should be known in the same way that a lot of, let's say, teachers from Hinduism and Buddhism have been sharing really widely. And mindfulness has found its place in so many contexts in the last, let's say, 20, 30 years that it was never in before.
So let's dig into that. What are some of those particular things that are different in the way that it's taught?
So often I see in Judaism a real emphasis on a separation of times for these particular mindsets that I was really compelled in, let's say, my earlier years, in my early 20s, by the idea of enlightenment in Zen Buddhism, let's say, as one example. And it's this, hopefully, this ability to be able to work while being at peace simultaneously, that I can really be in that in the moment. And though there might be people who can really pull that off, I have found it not the easiest path personally to take, because I find that I'm not at peace when I'm doing my emails, and that if I'm really focusing on making that a peaceful experience, I might be less productive, or I might be less peaceful. And so there are different types of people in the world, and there's, let's say, a Jewish perspective on that. And I'm generalizing, of course, but the piece that I really love, there's a time for transformation and for work and for rigor. And that's, let's say, when we're checking emails, or when we're lifting heavy things, or when we're trying to strive and change and transform. And is there a way of kind of carving out a mindset for that in our day or in our week? And on the other side, if we kind of cultivate peace, could we find moments during the day, 15 minutes at lunch, where we're eating our most favorite meal, or talking with our most favorite person, or going to the park and just taking a walk and we're turning our phone off? That's a moment of peace and restfulness that we can then take with us into the work. And not only that, when we really find that state of rest and peacefulness and even celebration or joy, often those are when the best ideas come to us about the work we're needing to do. And if we're not taking time really aside to enter into those moments, our work is suffering as well. So that's one perspective on it, is the division of times. But the other piece that I think is so important is the body-centered element, which is I can, at a break time or on the weekend, some people are going to really benefit from things like yoga or breathing, intentional breathing work, or mindfulness meditation. And maybe that can be a part of someone's practice. But another part is just the simplest things in life, like, oh, I'm going to take a nap right now. Or I'm going to shower, take a bath, or I am going to make sure that at lunchtime on Saturdays or Sundays or dinner, maybe for a whole 24 hours, I'm going to save all my best food and invite my favorite people and sing songs. And basically, these really simple, sensual practices can lead us to a place of being extremely pleased and delighted, and that leads to refreshment.
We don't do that anymore. It doesn't seem like most people do that anymore. Because as I look around, most people are running from work to a million kids' activities to something else. There isn't as much of that shutting down. And COVID has, depending on what you do, COVID may have even driven some of those lines. You know, people who are working from home now, it becomes even harder to separate different spaces and be able to do that. So if you're not comfortable with that, it's not easy at all. So in the title is the word mysticism. What is mysticism?
In the way that I use it, in the way it's often used in Judaism today, it's experiential spirituality. It's not let's say a mystic won't have a theory of what God is. A mystic will have an experience of some kind with deeper layers of reality. You could call them psychedelic experiences, but they don't need to be brought on with psychedelics. Yeah, it can happen, again, in nature. It could happen while dancing. It could happen in a dream. It could happen, while meditating. But however that happens, we gain information about sort of what's really going on here, perhaps, or what's deeper than our normal perceptions. And so mysticism is the pursuit or the cultivation of those kinds of magical moments, those peak experiences, and then the reflection afterwards. What makes Jewish mysticism maybe not unique, but a strong emphasis in Jewish mysticism is on not just those, let's say, blissful moments or those profound moments, but the insights that come from them, and then the way that they're lived out in the world. It's sort of how they culminate and how they change us as human beings. That someone can have an experience, let's say, of God's love as one example. And by the way, God, I'm using that term. Not everyone likes the term God. I'm happy to say spirit or reality or whatever, consciousness. They're just words. They're something that's beyond words. But someone can have an experience of, let's say, God's love or the true love of the universe. And then they can go back and they can get in a big argument with their partner, right? So that's not the ideal in Jewish mysticism. The ideal is to have that. And we all argue with our partners sometimes, right? That's human nature. But if I have an experience of God's love, I'm going to really try to feel that afterwards. And how is it resonating in my body or just in my mind in some way? And maybe I'm going to have an insight. And if I give it enough time and maybe contemplate it, journal about it, or even just kind of take a little break from the spiritual stuff for a while and let it filter through my system, the ideal is I'm going to be a more loving person in some way, or I'm going to have some changed understanding of what it means to relate to people or to other creatures on this earth.
It's funny. I always say everyone has everything they need within themselves. They just have to stop and look within. Too often we're looking outside for all the answers and not spending the time. And a lot of what you're talking about is taking the time to go within and having the peace to be able to listen beyond the normal monkey chatter we hear in our heads.
For sure. And sometimes the way people are, speaking of, raised with money perspectives from a young age, people are raised with emotional perspectives from a young age, with spiritual perspectives. And one of the hopes of not just the sort of, let's say, ecstatic, blissful, peaceful states, but some of the real deeper introspection that's also in my book about sort of let's say the bliss would be the spiritual Sabbath work or Shabbat work, and the deeper kind of self-inquiry and contemplation, understanding the constrictions within ourselves and where they come from. That's more the spiritual work. And we can uncover things that we didn't even know were there. And sometimes they can be honestly kind of scary or surprising. But I remember after doing a few years of real kind of somatic, like body-centered, feeling my body sensations and seeing what thoughts and emotions arose, I remember finding compassion inside that just sort of sprung up one day I didn't even know was there. I was raised to be a good person and to care about others, but there was a feeling of that compassion that didn't really come forth until I had done a few years of work when I was a young adult. And there's everything is within it. Sometimes it can just surprise us and hopefully delight us, at least in the long term, when we do some of that exploration. When you say you did the work, what does that mean? So the embodied part of Embodied Kabbalah. So you'll find elements of this in many traditions. And the way that I've gained most access to these kinds of practices are really through routes like psychology today. I really believe in exploring other contemplative practices, whether they're from scientific means or other traditions. But the world that I'm trained in is called focusing. And it has to do with, if I have a thought or a feeling, is there a way in which that interacts with what's called a felt sense? That most of us know the feeling of feeling a constriction in our chest when we're worried or anxious, or sometimes it's a pit in the stomach. So that would be like a negative example. But if someone has a great memory they're sharing, and I would invite them, let's say in a spiritual counseling session, to notice what's going on in their body at that moment. People often feel a warmth in the center of their chest when they're talking about really wonderful memories. So when we connect with the physical manifestation of our emotions or our thoughts, we can use that as an anchor to go a little bit deeper. So I could go into a very specific example, but essentially it's starting with some kind of thought emotion, feeling a physical sensation associated with it. And if it's a constricted emotion, in particular, something difficult, there's often something there just waiting to kind of pop out, an aha moment, an understanding. And then when that happens in that approach, you can actually feel a physical change as well. So it's emotional, it's physical, and often there's a mental, an insight that comes along with that at the same time.
Today's episode is sponsored by Prophet Answer Man Podcast. Did you know that most small business owners hate looking at their financials? It's one reason they may struggle with business success. The Prophet Answer Man podcast helps them ensure they are profitable and can pay their employees and weather the storms we all have to face. It's built on the Profit First methodology of pay yourself first. The Prophet Answer Man podcast is a must listen to for every small business owner and anyone who wants to help them survive and thrive. Check it out on your favorite listening platform. And I've been kind of reading a lot, studying a lot in this area, and it's incredible how much there is that physical sense that goes along with the mental idea. And it's almost like, you can think an angry thought and then your body turns into an angry stance. And then at other times your body starts with an angry stance and then you end up with angry thoughts. And it's learning how to control and to overcome that automatic kind of goings on and learning to quiet it and turn it off in a sense.
Yeah, I think I often think about it. There's sort of two primary routes we could take. And before we can either take either of those directions, we have to notice that it's happening in the first place. If I don't know that my body is feeling angry or I'm feeling angry and it's manifesting in my body, there's not a whole lot I can do with it. I'm running an autopilot. So the first step, and this is a big deal in personal development and spiritual development, is gaining a sense of how can I witness myself. And there's so many practices around that. And sometimes it just occurs to people or can come through great suffering. But I'm hoping that I'm passing it on to my kids from a young age. You know what I mean? Intergenerational wealth of the emotional or spiritual kind. And so once we notice that, one, let's say, option or approach is to transcend or to move beyond. And I associate that with that more Shabbat mindset, the more let's just celebrate and appreciate what we have right now. I can have a grateful thought, right? Or I can really just not get caught up in the difficulty, which, depending on the time of day or depending on a person's personality or context, that can be exactly what we need. The other side, again, which I go into detail in my book, is instead of transcending, we can transcend and contend. And contending means actually grappling with it. So maybe there's a reason why I'm feeling anxious right now. And it's not just a distraction. Actually, that thought that just came up, it's telling me I have something I need to do that I haven't done today. And so I'm not going to just, push it away, which if I'm busy, I can't. But actually, no, I need to think about that. Or let's say I had a presentation I gave to a community or some work project that didn't go well. A part of me wants to just move on to the next thing right away. But if I'm noticing a pain pattern of any kind in my body, well, maybe there's actually some learning there. And that through exploring it and listening, it's more about, in this case, listening in and trying to understand what's going on, I might learn a thing or two. And maybe there's a real piece of wisdom or insight I can take from that and I can move forward with it. So those are the two routes to take once we have that self-awareness.
And the first step is awareness.
Absolutely.
Which is a big part of it, and it's a common theme. So, kind of shifting gears a little, what exactly is Kabbalah?
So this is a word that is used in so many different ways. I have an article I wrote in the last year called The 12 Types of Kabbalah, and it's all about the different ways people use it in the past and the present. But when I use it in the book, what I mean is the whole history of Jewish spirituality. And Judaism as really a householder path. It's a path. We didn't have monks ever, really, in Judaism. We had our spiritual teachers are people most often with families and jobs. And so Jewish spirituality is, I think, extremely useful right now because it is helping people who have families and jobs or dependents and real obligations finding that middle ground between all of it. Is it possible to have a rich spiritual life and also gain wealth and also be able to show up on time and pay our taxes and be a good, kind person all simultaneously? It's a challenge and it's a walk that a lot of us are doing. And so in that sense, Kabbalah is just that whole unfolding of this Jewish perspective on spirituality over the generations.
Interesting. And one of the things that I've kind of learned is within the Jewish tradition, there's the written history, and then there's also a oral history that's somewhat passed down as well. And I think the other part of what I see is it's not always easy to interpret what was originally said, because if you look at the Old Testament, English is not what it was written in. And even certain things, like if I said to you today, it's raining cats and dogs, like 1,000 years from now, people are like, how did it rain? Like they'd be trying to figure that out and understand it. And in the same way, I think even in the Bible, it says it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom. And it seems like nobody can explain this either. There's all these things that come out, and I'd love to just kind of get your perspective on some of that.
Yeah, Judaism in many ways is in the interpretation, and it's not in the literal read. It's very hard to sum up a whole religion, but one of my favorite ways of summing up Judaism is that it's thousands of years of discussion on how we should live, and the best way we can accomplish what we need and be kind to each other and help make this world a better place. But it's discussion based, because the final word, the final truth is not easily to be found. If there's one agreement I think most people have, it's that we should be kind to each other. But pretty much everything else is up for grabs based on the different era. So the literal read of the Hebrew Bible, or of the first 5 books in the Torah, there are very few interpretations that just follow a literal read. And in fact, for the last 2,000 years, at the same time that Christianity was arising and evolving, and that the New Testament was being written, the Jewish project at the time was called the Talmud, and that was essentially a really profound, expansive, and radical reinterpretation of the Hebrew Bible, which starts this whole new era. And Judaism today is, and for some, this would be a controversial statement. I think academically it's bang on. Judaism is more about the Talmud than the Hebrew Bible, because the Talmud is the filter through which it's all seen. And it's just discussions and disagreements between hundreds of rabbis over hundreds of years. And that forms this basis for what we have today. And that's often called the oral law, but it's really just part of that tradition of kind of dissecting, understanding, reinterpreting. And some of it's very drastic reinterpretation, some of it's quite plain and obvious. But it's a really important part of our religion to be open to the discussion and the disagreement. And there's, as a rabbi, I'm very used to having people argue with me, students and colleagues and everyone else. And that's, hopefully it's done with, again, compassion and mutual relationship building. But I don't have the final word on anything that I teach. I present topics and lead discussions more than anything.
Is that challenge and that discussion prevalent in other religions?
One of the places I know it shows up with a lot of, again, sort of centrality is in Tibetan Buddhist circles. There's a style of debate, which is very important, and it's challenging each other. And there's a whole system of the kind of states of mind, that it's a vast system that's memorized and then challenged and refined through a very intentional debate by Tibetan Buddhist monks. And I think there are cultures where that's very common. I've probably studied more Hindu texts than I have been in dialogue with Hindu practitioners, but I know there's a really rich philosophical tradition, and there's different angles and approaches. Now, I don't know how central it is, let's say, among the Brahmin class or caste from India, the sort of priest ritual leaders and the scholars to argue all these things, but it's around. And I know certainly in a lot of my contemporary Christian colleagues, we enjoy discussion and debate. Though I think the stereotype might be, or maybe the strong thrust historically, and in some, maybe much of Christianity has been more about doctrine and truth. But I'm not really in a place to say, because I really can say with more certainty Buddhism and Judaism that I've studied more in depth have a lot of that, those qualities.
So after these hundreds of years of discussing, how should we live?
How should we live? Well, here's the answer. And no, as you're probably not surprised to hear, there's a lot of different approaches. But for me, what I found, the teachings that have stuck out most prominently and I think are most useful today, they have to do with balance. That, there's a season for everything. And there's a time to mourn and a time to dance. I mean, now I'm quoting the Hebrew Bible again, right? Or the Birds, that band from the 60s, right? Do everything, turn, there is a season. I guess that's really, is it Bob Dylan? In any case, that maybe composed that version of it. But it's moderation. And I think there are times to be extreme and to go for certain things, but I really think about the long game versus the short game. So that's one element. Again, if we're not kind to each other, we're not doing the right thing. But if our compassion exceeds our boundaries, if we are so compassionate for others that we're not taking care of ourselves, that's an issue as well. And similarly, if we're working so much that we're not taking time to fill our let's say, happiness buckets or our spirituality buckets, that's imbalanced as well. Again, if I could quote hundreds of Jewish teachings on this topic, but balance in all things, including balance. Sometimes we need to be imbalanced for a while. That to me is a really important part of how we should live. I could say inspired by Judaism for today's world.
We stopped using the word balance because people thought that meant equal. And as you've said, it's not equal. It changes. And that's why I like to use harmony, because when you listen to a song, there are times that different instruments or voices or parts come to the forefront. And then there's times that they go to the back. They're still there, but they're not as prominent. And that's kind of the way you described it, is different parts of life come to the forefront. And sometimes you have to sprint, but then you also have to come back and go the other direction as well.
Absolutely. So one of the other main definitions of Kabbalah that I didn't share before was it's a particular mystical movement in the Middle Ages. It started in Spain and France in the Jewish world. And they have these levels, these layers called the Sephirot. You can see charts of this online. You can see it in my book, but it's basically different dimensions and the way God manifests in the world. So the central quality, the central element of that whole structure, that ladder, is called Tiferet, which is often understood as harmony. That there's all these different qualities that surround it, but the central axis is harmony or beauty, or it's also described as true compassion. I'll just give a quick example. That on one side of that quality is called Chesed, which basically means yes. It means loving kindness, bounty, expansiveness. But on the other side is Gevura, which means power or strength or boundaries, and the word no. And so let's imagine we're raising a child and all we give them is yes, yes, yes. You might seem that as loving, right? Chesed means love. But if all you're doing is saying yes to a child, they're never going to learn how to save their money, right? They're never going to learn a ton of things. It's spoiling them. But if, on the other hand, if all you have is Gevura, the no, the boundaries, that's somewhere in the realm of abuse potentially. Can I do this? No. And it's, if we do only one of those to the extreme, we're not doing a good job. But if we focus on that central element of harmony, there's a time to say yes and there's a time to say no. And the key to Tiferet, that central axis, is, can we know the difference? Can we know when there's a time for yes and a time for no? And so too can we know when there's a time for rest and a time for action. But it's like a musical composition, that there's sometimes when it's time for the bass solo. It's time for the singing to come in. There's a quiet part and a loud part, but it's all part of that beauty and the flow that makes a great piece of music.
That it does. Do you find that most people actually understand their religion that they say they believe in?
I don't think I understand my religion, Rocky. And what I mean by that is, the more I have learned about Judaism, and I've spent a good part of 20 years doing that really actively, the more I've realized there's so much left to uncover. So on the one hand, religions are thousands of years with billions of people or millions of people and countless texts and practices. And so the idea that we could ever fully understand it is, I just don't think it's possible. But on a more realistic sense, I think there's a way in which we can really go deeper and connect. I think it's about connecting to ancestry, human beings, to have relationships with people that came before them. Because often those people had ideas or ways of thinking that were quite useful. And so my own journey growing up in a Jewish culture and then discovering the religion and the spirituality more so later on was incredibly helpful, because I was trying to leave a lot of it behind. And when I finally went to rabbinical school, so I went to this Buddhist university to be a universalist, and I finally went to rabbinical school, I realized the stuff that I most valued in my universal spiritual life was found within Judaism. No one had taught me that yet. And some of these texts were untranslated. And so that's really what came out in my book. But for all of us, yeah, we think we know it, but most of us haven't read even the central texts of our religions, let alone the commentaries that I think the most really holistic human need that we can fulfill by doing that is connecting with our lineage, where we come from, and for the hope of nuancing it and realizing there's a lot more agreement we might have, or even a lot more, let's say, shades of gray than we might have thought when we first started.
There are many shades of gray. You mentioned something, and we're seeing it societally, right? You see a lot more people walking away from religion. Comments or commentary on why that might be?
Well, there's a few quotes that come to mind, but I'll say it in my own words, is if religion was compelling and relevant, people wouldn't walk away from it. And religion has always evolved and changed. And one of the ways it's evolved and changed is when people start walking away from it because it's not relevant and compelling to them. Yes, we live in an age of religious freedom, and that's a wonderful thing. And it's also an opportunity for people who are trying to hold down religious institutions or structures to say, people would rather do this than come to my church or synagogue or temple or mosque. And why is that? Because right now, as a religious leader, first of all, I'm not the kind of person who likes big authority plays and power plays and those kinds of things, which is one of the reasons I'm doing work independently. But if I don't have the tools of social control that a past religious leader might have. And so if people are walking away, but they might not be walking just into, let's say, materialistic pleasure. Maybe they are, but maybe they're going to yoga class. Or maybe, you know what I mean? Or maybe they're scrolling their social media. And what about those things is more compelling than coming to a religious service? Human beings have materialistic qualities. They have spiritual qualities in every era. And if a religion isn't keeping up with that, or keeping up with science, or keeping up with just the newness in the world, people are going to leave. And they should, quite frankly. That religions need to do the work right now to update themselves and it's not about marketing. It's really about being more compelling and changing and evolving and being open. And so I see all of those reasons why people are walking away. And I actually think it's a good thing in the long term for these religions to see that and to have to contend with it.
Why is it a good thing?
Because religions that have been around for thousands of years have relied on innovation to do that. The idea that Judaism hasn't changed over the past thousands of years it's just not true. Same with Christianity, same with Hinduism, same with Buddhism. They change. And if people aren't wanting to be a part of them and they're walking away because they can, because we have freedom of religion, and at least in our societies, that's an opportunity for that growth to happen in a new way. Most people don't realize that religions change drastically. It's because religions are often very good at convincing people this is the way it's always been. But it hasn't. And I could give you many examples, but in essence, people walking away and religions wanting to reach them is an opportunity for growth and change, because we don't want to leave them all behind. Religions are storehouses of wisdom. We actually need them. They connect us to the past and to fundamental parts of ourselves as we're exploring the newness in our world, whether it's technological or medical or philosophical. We need an anchor, but the anchor needs the innovation, and it's this mutual relationship.
What are some of the biggest changes that people would be surprised at, knowing that have occurred over the hundreds or thousands of years?
I'll use a couple examples from a couple different religions. So a long time ago, Judaism was a culture that was centered around a temple in a particular place. And there's most of the laws, or many of the laws, almost half, let's say, or maybe a third in the Torah out of the hundreds that are there have to do with how to sacrifice animals and plants in a temple. Nobody does that anymore. people think that the prayer service, which is a very central to synagogue life, is the way it's always been. Even if they know that it used to be sacrificed, they think about that as the quintessential Jewish practice in synagogue of prayer. And guess what? There's a lot of people, let's say who I grew up with, who really don't go to synagogue because they don't like those prayers. And they don't understand them, or they do understand them and it's not the kind of God they want to relate to, this sort of kingly, masculine, they want something else. But if I can tell people, since the Middle Ages, there have been major figures in our religion that have sought to do more meditation, or even before that, like in services. Why, if our ancestors stopped sacrificing plants and animals, and could we stop doing these prayer services in synagogue? Could we do more meditation or movement? There's a precedent for that already in our religion, that when things didn't work, we adapted and we changed. So that's one example I can give. Another that comes to mind is Mahayana Buddhism, which is, people think about Zen Buddhism. That started, well, at least I would say hundreds or if not 1,000 plus years after the Buddha lived. And it was this attitude that primarily, I guess the central element was that a person actually shouldn't attain full enlightenment until everyone's enlightened. The bodhisattva is this sort of servant, enlightened, pseudo-enlightened person that delays their final enlightenment for the sake of helping others. And when that form of Buddhism arose, it was called the Mahayana heresy at the time. And today it's just Buddhism, right? But at the time it was extremely controversial and separate and strange and new. But today we look back and say, oh, that's Buddhism, right? That's Zen. Zen is a Mahayana movement, but it broke with the original system.
Interesting. And it's funny how you talked about people they don't even know what the prayers are, or they don't know what they mean, or yes, they've decided that they don't want to believe that, which is fine. I think everyone has to kind of pick their choice there. But at the same time, you get all of these schisms and fractures, and everyone seems to then get separated, and just like sports, well, this is my team. And how do you bring it all back together?
Well, I think sports is a great example because by and large, people aren't killing each other over soccer. By and large, they're not killing each other over basketball. I actually love the idea of different camps within these traditions because people are different and geography is different and climate is different and language is different. I think we should find the things that work best for us unless we start killing each other. Unless we start othering each other in major ways. And religion is an incredibly powerful tool of control, as well as it is a storehouse for wisdom and spirituality. So this was something that my wife told me. She thought she learned it from a Sufi teacher, right? Like a Muslim or a sort of a universal Muslim-inspired teacher. But in fact, it turns out she made it up and she misunderstood that original teaching. But it's a great teaching, is that one day religion can be like music. And so I used to listen to rock and roll as a kid, and then I got into hip hop and jam music and bluegrass and jazz and all these different types. And that was wonderful. And as I evolved, my musical tastes evolved. And what if religion was like that? That we might have a sort of a type of music that at the end of the day, that's really who we are. We love that it's persisted throughout all these ages and stages. But we can also explore. We can combine genres and make new forms. There's artists that come out that are celebrated because they're being creative. And nobody's fighting wars over bluegrass.
Hopefully not.
Yeah, that'll be the day.
So you made an interesting comment there that religions are storehouses of power. Can you expand on that?
The way I understand it is that often people who start religions, let's say, or inspire people to start religions in history. I'm talking about Jesus. I'm talking about the Buddha. Let's talk about Moses. I'm not sure Moses is an actual historical figure, or Abraham, but these incredibly influential people that are remembered in stories for their teachings, they're what I call peakers. They're people who have peak experiences. These are mystics, primarily, who have some kind of connection with the divine or with what lies beyond. And from that comes teachings and actions, and it's incredibly inspiring. Those are peakers. But if it wasn't for the people who are holding those onto those teachings and institutionalizing them, or those are the keepers. They're tending the fires of those teachings, and they're transforming them often in ways over time. And we need both. We need the peakers and we need the keepers. We need, right, the people inspiring and the people passing on. And there's a lot more. There's the people who are interpreting that knowledge and all sorts of different roles there. But often we can think about religion as a combination of those initial inspirations and then all the people that get involved to institutionalize, to pass on. But guess what? You can also use those teachings to, in the worst sense, manipulate and control people. That let's say someone has a mystical experience where they not just see God, but they see the afterlife and they see heaven, right? Or maybe they have a mystical experience where they see hell and they see people trapped in some underworld that's torturous. Okay, what are we going to learn from that? We can learn that we need to maybe rescue people from hell, in some way, in some kind of astral travel out of body way. We could learn that we need to be very good to each other so we don't have a regretful afterlife. There's a million things we could take, but let's say a few generations later, someone remembers those stories and they say, if you don't follow me, you're going to hell. And if you do follow me, you're going to heaven. And they can use these profound insights that come from those kinds of moments to control others. And when a state, like a whole country, takes that on, there's very few means of control that are more powerful than really well thought out theologies and really well thought out practices and rigorous laws over things that might otherwise not be so important.
So what advice would you give to somebody who is struggling with all these religious beliefs, not sure exactly where they want to go or what they want to do? What can they do to explore, I guess, in a sense?
The first thing that comes to mind is I love books. I love reading books. I love having books in my home, and I've learned a ton. But for learning about religions or spirituality, books are actually a good step towards that. But we can get really in our heads, but also it's hard to guide ourselves in some of these big questions. And so I would recommend exploring communities, looking for teachers, finding actual transmission from actual living people or practices in community. And we need to explore, we need to investigate, we need to experiment, I think. Right now, there's so much possibility in our religious and spiritual world that it can be confusing. So if we can try something out and then reflect on it and try something else out, again, books are great, but if we're only reading books, we're probably often going to be spinning in more circles than actually finding the path forward.
I've always said I can read all the books on golf there are, but I'll never learn to hit a golf ball.
That's a really high level spiritually to be able to hit a golf ball, I think. It's a big accomplishment, quite revered in a lot of traditions.
You have to actually get out and try stuff and do things. Reading is one step, but you actually have to practice and do the work.
Absolutely. And in addition to that, I think it's taking time to digest. When people ask me, who is God, or I don't know if I believe in God, I tend to say, the idea of believing in God is probably believing in someone else's version of what's really going on here. That I encourage people as much as possible to trust their own experience. And yeah, there's a time for reading ideas about God or about the world, but there's also a time for thinking, what do I really think? Can I find that inner wisdom? Can I find that inner place? Or can I just trust my reality and what I've encountered to kind of construct my own version of what's really going on here? That it's a combination of exposing ourselves to newness and also taking time to really integrate that and to come back to a place of wholeness before we expose ourselves again.
That makes a ton of sense. So if people want to practice this and try learning and maybe taking that next step and doing it, any advice for them?
Yeah, there's a concept that occurs multiple times in the teachings that I bring forth in my book. It's called running and returning. It is actually originally a quote from the book of Ezekiel in the Bible, but it becomes this really central metaphor for the Jewish mystics where you can leave your ordinary, comfortable world, and that's running towards something. You're going out of the comfort zone. That could be in a spiritual moment. It could be exploring a new community or a new philosophy, trying out a new teacher or coach. But after we have that running experience, the idea, if we're always running and running and running, we're not actually going to get to that part where we have more wholeness and coherence. So the returning is the next step. So we run towards something, we have an experience, an encounter, but when we return, we take time to integrate. And that really means taking time off the running. It can be as simple as that. Take a break. If I have a spiritual experience from a meditation, I stop meditating and I let that filter through because I don't want to go too high. I don't want to go too flighty or outwards. I actually want to take time and process that. Comes a point in the integration and the returning where I know it's time to run again. I know it's time to explore. So that dynamic of the back and forth forms a wonderful dichotomy and a wonderful approach to that kind of work and the growth in a lot of those ways.
And I think that's a perfect way to bring it to a close. It's time to learn the secrets of life. What's your secret to living an abundant life?
My secret is that I find very intentional times to really, really work hard. And I find very intentional times to really rest hard, to really focus on abundance and all that is good. And if my mind can't get there, I fill my belly with the most delicious food that I can. I spend time around the people I love most in the world, and I sing hilarious, fun, deep, meaningful songs with my family.
There is nothing like a good meal to bring people together. What did you learn later in life that you wish you would have learned sooner?
Slow down. I was someone who loved to run towards new things all the time, and I got burnt pretty badly as a young adult. And I wish someone had, or maybe they did and I didn't listen, but I wish I had learned sooner that it really does take time to grow and develop, and that it's okay to walk a slow and steady path.
And I think that's a constant theme you've been sharing throughout this entire interview, is that constant learn to slow down, learn to be mindful, learn to turn off. And I think more people could enjoy that.
Yeah, I think it relates to wealth as well, by the way. That it doesn't have to happen all at once. That the idea of slow savings and investments, for example, is just occurring to me as we're speaking.
And that is the way to build wealth, slow and steady. That is the way you keep wealth, too, is when you build it in such ways. If you were to give an 18-year-old one specific piece of wisdom, what would it be?
I would tell that 18-year-old to spend a good amount of time looking around, trying new things, and then finding that sweet spot between your passion and your reason, your passion and your intellect, and finding a wise choice forward, whatever that is also really driven by what you truly, deeply, madly love in this world.
And that requires you to kind of go explore different things, which is kind of another central theme we've been chatting about.
Absolutely.
If people would like to learn more about you, the book, what's the best way for them to do that?
So they can go to my website, MatthewPonak.com, MatthewPonak.com. There's a page there about my book, as well as my offerings, my speaking and counseling, and the courses that I offer.
And we'll make sure to include that. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Rocky. I really enjoyed the conversation with you today.
Was that what you expected? Did we open up some topics to think about? An area to explore? I love the simplicity of rest, breaking bread, eating, and fun being a major part of the weekend, and taking the time to enjoy it. What about you? Can you schedule downtime every week to recharge, to get away, to be in nature, and to let go, to find your song, your harmony, and then live in it? That's a secret to living a richer soul life. Matter of fact, I'm about to leave for 3 days. It's a shutdown. It's where I review what the last 3 months were, whether I'm happy with them, and what do I want the next 3 months to be. And I get out of the house, because if I'm home, I'm going to do household stuff. If you enjoyed or got value out of this episode, I'd really appreciate if you support it by forwarding it to a friend or sharing it wherever you typically share these sorts of things. Next week, we've got Anthony Poponi to talk about positive psychology. Thanks for listening. Have an abundant week.